The prohibition on same-sex intercourse that we find in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 is not transferable to contemporary Christian societies in anything remotely approximating an authoritative way. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. We can consider a bunch of different features of this prohibition. One, what precisely is being prohibited? It is prohibiting a man from taking the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. You try to transfer that, you're not getting the whole package. You're just getting a prohibition on a man taking the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. Now, some people are going to object. Leviticus 20:13 condemns both parties to death, so obviously both parties are equally culpable. Well, no, that's actually not accurate, and that brings up the rationalization for the actual prohibition. See, anciently sex was not an activity that two equal partners mutually engaged in. It was something that an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object, and the agency and the consent of that passive sexual object were irrelevant. Now, what Leviticus 20 is doing is expanding on the penalties for the different illicit sexual acts that are prohibited in Leviticus 18. And in every instance, both parties are condemned to the same penalty, not because both parties are equally culpable. They aren't. The animal is put to death in the case of bestiality, but their agency and consent was obviously irrelevant. Leviticus is not commanding the animals to behave in a certain way. It's because this illicit sexual act was considered to generate a kind of metaphysical contamination that polluted the land and that could result in the land vomiting the people out. And this contamination was perceived to be produced because these sexual acts violated socially conventionalized boundaries and categories and hierarchies. And when it comes to male same-sex intercourse, men are at the top of the socially conventionalized hierarchy of domination. And so to sexually subordinate and penetrate a man is to violate that hierarchy and to violate his sexual agency, turning him into a passive sexual object. And they understood that contamination to be purged only through the application of the same penalty to both involved parties. Again, irrespective of the agency or the consent. Now, that brings us to the motivation. What's actually underlying these outdated and scientifically inaccurate rationalizations? The motivation is the intuitive impulse to seek out sanctity and purity. This is what cognitive scientists call sexual disgust sensitivity, and there are a bunch of studies on how this contributes to opposition to LGBTQ plus identities. And this is something that can be mitigated and can be eliminated through education, through interactions with LGBTQ plus people, because you learn that there's nothing wrong with them. You learn that they are perfectly human and that there is no contamination being generated by their sexual identity. So the actual prohibition itself is not transferable. The rationalization is obviously not transferable. The motivation, while it is still active today, it's not authoritative. You can't say that this needs to be prohibited because it gives me the ick. That's not an actual argument. The scope is not transferable because Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 are addressing members of the house of Israel occupying the land of Israel. If you are not a member of the house of Israel, if you are not occupying the land of Israel, this has nothing to do with you. So it is not transferable to contemporary Christian societies. Now, that brings up the punishment. In Leviticus 18, the punishment is that you will be cut off. This could mean a lot of different things, but it's not transferable in an authoritative way to today. In Leviticus 20, it's the death penalty. Also, non-transferable to Christian societies today. And if you're among those groups who are trying to advocate for execution of members of the LGBTQ plus community, you need to grow the hell up. So none of these prohibitions on a man taking the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse are transferable to contemporary Christian societies. So why do so many Christians today continue to appeal so blithely to these utterly irrelevant passages from Leviticus? It's because homophobia continues to be a central identity marker for a lot of conservative Christians, and they need all the proof texts they can get. And it doesn't matter that they have to divest it of its context, that they have to ignore the actual prohibition, that the rationalization is irrelevant, that the motivation is not authoritative, that the scope is irrelevant, that the punishment is not authoritative. Because all they're looking for is a proof text that they can leverage in the structuring of power and values and boundaries in the service of their right-wing authoritarian identity politics. It's all about identity politics, it's all about power, and unfortunately, it is increasingly about money, which means the liberty, the humanity, the very lives of LGBTQ plus men, women, and children are being hurled onto the altar of right-wing authoritarian conservative Christian identity politics just so people can have more power and money. And that has simply got to stop. And the fit for this video has been Micah 6:8.